In Oregon, the sudden disappearance of a young college student in broad daylight signals the work of a particular kind of predator, someone calculating, experienced, and cold-blooded. When this happens, the Bureau quickly mobilizes. A kidnapping in broad daylight, without a single witness, is a rare and alarming event. Investigators have almost nothing to go on. It's around 10 a.m. when one 9-year-old Brooke Wilberger begins her morning routine at the Oak Park Apartments, located near Oregon State University. The apartment complex is managed by her sister, Stephanie, and brother-in-law, Zach. On this clear, sunny morning, Brooke is helping with some maintenance tasks, cleaning the light posts and checking on tenants' units. It's a simple, familiar job, something she's done many times before. Brooke, a bright and beautiful blonde, is a sophomore at Brigham Young University, where she studies speech pathology. Each summer, she returns home to Oregon to work and spend time with her family. Her sister recalls how close Brooke was to them and their children, describing her as warm, reliable, and deeply caring. That morning, Brooke plans to meet Stephanie for lunch at noon. As Zach leaves to check a few vacant apartments, everything seems perfectly ordinary. But when lunchtime comes, Brooke never shows up. Repeated calls to her phone go unanswered. For her sister, this is immediately unsettling. Brooke would never simply vanish without a word. Something is very wrong. Zach called out for Brooke as he searched the quiet apartment complex, hoping she would answer. He knew which apartments she had been assigned to check that morning, and during short breaks from his own duties, he began looking through them one by one. Each time he found nothing, his unease grew stronger. He later explained that he had gone through every unit Brooke was supposed to visit but couldn't find her anywhere. His concern deepened further when he returned to their apartment and saw that her wallet and keys were still inside. Outside, her car remained parked in the same spot, untouched since the morning. Near the lamp post where she had been working, he discovered her flip-flops and the bucket she had been using. That was the moment he began to feel that something was seriously wrong. By around 3 p.m., after hours of searching without success, Zach decided to call Brooke's mother, Cammie, to ask whether she had heard from her daughter. Cammie immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. She later said she had known right away that Brooke would never just walk off or leave without telling anyone. Even while away at college, Brooke had made a point to call her every day. The family began contacting hospitals and searching the entire apartment complex repeatedly. When all efforts failed, Zach decided to contact the authorities. In his 911 call, he identified himself as the manager of the Oak Park Apartments and explained that his 9-year-old sister-in-law had been doing outdoor maintenance work earlier that day. He reported that her belongings and shoes were still at the site, but she had been missing for several hours. Within minutes, Detective Shan Hall and his partner from the Corvallis Police Department arrived at the complex. They interviewed Zach and his wife, Stephanie, asking whether Brooke might have left for lunch, gone shopping, or visited a friend. Zach told them that Brooke had never left the complex during her work hours and had always been reliable in the years she had helped there. By that point, the investigators began to realize that Brooke's disappearance was not a misunderstanding, it was the beginning of something far more troubling. Detectives soon discovered that at the time she vanished, Brooke had been dressed in a hooded sweatshirt, an Anne Klein wristwatch, and a ring engraved with the letters CTR. The inscription, short for Choose the Right, was a well-known Mormon motto, a simple but powerful reminder to live with honesty, faith, and moral strength. Detective Hall then made his way to the spot near the lamppost where Brooke had last been seen. What he found there immediately filled him with unease. Her cleaning supplies were still neatly arranged beside the post, untouched since that morning. Just a few steps away lay her flip-flops left behind in broad daylight, something entirely out of character for Brooke. As Hall examined the area more closely, he noticed that one of the flip-flops was torn, the toe strap ripped completely free. After 14 years in law enforcement, he knew that kind of damage rarely happened by accident. To him, the sandals didn't look worn out or carelessly discarded, they looked like evidence of a struggle. It appeared as though Brooke had been pulled or forced away so abruptly that her footwear had been torn from her feet. At that moment, Detective Hall became certain that Brooke hadn't simply walked away. Whatever had happened, it was far more serious than anyone had first imagined. Within minutes, the once quiet apartment complex was transformed into a chaotic scene of flashing lights and urgency. Patrol cars and unmarked vehicles poured in as officers moved swiftly to secure the area with bright yellow tape. Shortly after, Brooke's parents arrived, only to be met with every parent's worst nightmare: a parking lot filled with police activity, investigators combing the scene, and a heavy silence that spoke louder than words. Her mother would later describe the moment as utterly terrifying, recalling how her heart sank the instant she saw the swarm of officers and flashing lights. Detectives wasted no time. They began knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, questioning residents and handing out missing person flyers. By evening, a website dedicated to finding Brooke had gone live, and local news stations in nearby Eugene had joined in spreading the word. The response from the Corvallis community was immediate and overwhelming. In just a few hours, word of Brooke's disappearance had reached nearly every corner of town. What had begun as a quiet spring day had turned into a chilling mystery that shook the heart of a small, close-knit community, one that refused to stand by silently while one of their own was missing. By the time darkness settled over Corvallis, hundreds of volunteers had gathered, flashlights in hand, ready to help search for Brooke. The news of her disappearance had spread rapidly, uniting the community in a collective sense of urgency and fear. Neighbors, students, and even strangers from nearby towns arrived, determined to do whatever they could to bring the young woman home. As investigators began collecting statements, several residents of the Oak Park apartments reported hearing something chilling earlier that morning, a scream that shattered the quiet around 10 a.m., the same time Brooke was last seen. 3 separate witnesses described hearing a brief but piercing cry, sharp enough to carry through the still air and into their apartments. Each of them lived in different sections of the complex, yet none recalled seeing any disturbance or unusual activity afterward. The lack of follow-up noise, no struggle, no running footsteps left detectives deeply unsettled. It was as though something terrible had happened in an instant, and then complete silence had followed. For investigators, the situation was dire. Experience had taught them that in abduction cases, every passing minute mattered. The statistics painted a grim reality. Nearly half of all abducted victims lose their lives within the first hour, more than 75% within 3, and close to 90% within 24. Realizing that Brooke had already been missing for nearly 5 hours by the time the call came in, detectives knew they were racing against time, and that every second could make the difference between finding answers and losing them forever. The Corvallis Police Department wasted no time in escalating the search for Brooke. Within hours, they assembled a multi-agency task force and reached out to federal authorities for support. Knowing they were facing a potential abduction case, they called in the one organization best equipped to handle such investigations, the FBI. At around 6:30 that evening, Supervisory Special Agent Joe Boyer, a seasoned investigator with 22 years of experience, received the urgent call. He later recalled that, at that moment, no one could say for certain what had happened to Brooke. If her disappearance was the result of a random abduction, it might mean they were dealing with a serial predator or even a federal kidnapping case that had crossed state lines. The uncertainty was alarming, and every passing minute made the situation more critical. Recognizing the potential gravity, the FBI immediately committed its resources to the investigation. By 8 a.m., the next morning, Agent Boyer arrived at the newly established command center inside Corvallis Police Headquarters. Joining him was Special Agent Tim Suttles, a former district attorney, investigator, and trained hostage negotiator. Together, they began reviewing Brooke's background, movements, and the early evidence collected from the scene. It didn't take long for both agents and everyone on the task force to reach the same sobering conclusion. Brooke had not simply walked away. The only explanation that fit the facts was that she had been taken against her will. Although evidence was painfully limited, the task force refused to give up hope. Detective Sean Hall, who had been involved since the first moments of the case, made a personal promise to himself and to Brooke's family that he would not rest until he discovered what had happened to the missing young woman. Hall carried a constant reminder of that promise with him everywhere he went. Brooke's mother had given him a small photo of her daughter, which he kept carefully tucked inside his wallet. Each morning before heading out, he would look at the picture and remind himself that Brooke was not just another name on a report or a case number in a file. She was a daughter, a sister, and a beloved member of a family whose lives had been shattered. That simple act kept him grounded, driving him to pour every ounce of effort into the investigation. But what Hall could not have anticipated was how grueling the months ahead would be. Despite the task force's tireless dedication, the search brought more frustration than progress. Days turned into weeks, and leads faded almost as quickly as they appeared. Each passing hour made it harder to believe that Brooke could still be found alive. The detectives faced what felt like an impossible challenge. There was no clear crime scene, no known suspect, and no physical evidence to guide them. All they had were Brooke's flip-flops, her bucket of cleaning supplies, and the haunting reports from 3 witnesses who had heard a scream. There was no description of a getaway vehicle, no eyewitness to an abduction, and no direction in which to turn. It was as if Brooke had simply vanished into thin air. By the 25th of May, 2004, just one day after 9-year-old Brooke Wilberger had vanished while cleaning a lamppost near Oregon State University, the FBI and local task force were racing against time. Their goal was simple yet daunting: to find Brooke alive. But as one investigator later reflected, most criminal cases begin with something tangible: a body, a crime scene, a suspect, or at least a witness. In Brooke's case, there was none of that. They were starting entirely from nothing. In the days that followed, Brooke's family threw themselves into action. Determined not to let her story fade, they created a website, findbrooke.com, and organized a massive awareness campaign. Over 4,000 posters, banners, and billboards featuring Brooke's photo and details of her disappearance were distributed throughout Oregon. Though the Wilbergers were typically a quiet, private family, they understood that sharing Brooke's image as widely as possible was their best chance of finding her. Their efforts quickly made an impact. Almost immediately, tips began pouring in from across the state. Phone lines buzzed non-stop, and emails arrived by the dozens each hour. But with this sudden wave of information came a new and overwhelming challenge: figuring out which leads might actually matter. Many callers were sincere, offering observations or hunches they believed could help, yet few had anything solid to provide. Within days, the command center was buried under stacks of tip sheets. Investigators had no choice but to start sorting through them one by one, trying to decide which clues were worth chasing first. Among the flood of reports investigators received, 2 stood out as particularly significant. Multiple witnesses described seeing a suspicious man driving a green van near the Oregon State University campus on the morning Brooke vanished. One woman mentioned that the van's back seat was missing and admitted she had felt uneasy the moment she noticed it. She had been walking northbound when the vehicle drew her attention, an observation that would soon become a key detail in the investigation. According to witness statements, a young woman recounted that the man in the green van had approached her earlier that morning. He had driven up from behind, pulled ahead to block her path, and claimed to be lost while asking for help with a map. She later told investigators that something about the situation felt wrong. The man's tone and behavior made her instinctively uncomfortable, as if she knew she needed to get away. A second woman described an encounter that was almost identical. Near Oregon State University's Reser Stadium, she had also seen a green van, this one displaying Minnesota license plates. The man behind the wheel had attempted to engage her in conversation, but his actions set off immediate alarm. She later recalled that the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, certain that his behavior was predatory. Investigators noted that the man's approach matched a familiar pattern seen in abduction cases involving sexual predators, where offenders use conversation, false pretenses, or feigned helplessness to lure unsuspecting victims into vulnerable situations. Agents soon recognized that the reports involving a green van could be the breakthrough they needed, but only if they could uncover more concrete information. By that point, the task force had received so many van-related tips that they had started keeping separate notebooks, one dedicated to white vans, another to green ones, and a third for everything else. Investigators knew from experience that in most stranger abductions, vans were the vehicle of choice. The reason was straightforward. They offered space, concealment, and a quick means of escape, allowing an abductor to hide a victim without drawing attention. Despite how promising the tip seemed, investigators still had little to build on. No license plate number had been confirmed, no accurate description of the driver existed, and no other distinguishing details about the van had surfaced. Each lead seemed to dissolve into uncertainty, leaving the task force frustrated but determined. In the meantime, the investigation widened. Detectives began reviewing the backgrounds of anyone in the area who might fit the profile of a potential abductor. They meticulously examined records of hundreds of registered sex offenders and known predators living in and around Corvallis. Every name on the list was checked, every address visited. For Brooks' family, these updates were almost too much to bear. Investigators kept them informed of each new lead, but many of the details were deeply distressing. Brooks' mother later recalled that hearing about the number of sex offenders in their community made her physically sick. She remembered sitting on the edge of her bed as detectives explained their findings and eventually having to lie down, overwhelmed by the grim reality of what those words might mean for her daughter. The search for Brooke was growing more urgent with every passing hour, and each new finding only deepened the fear that something truly terrible had happened. Captain Ron Noble of the Corvallis Police Department soon faced the media, announcing that investigators were prepared to release new information regarding Brooke Wilberger's disappearance. It was May 27th, 3 days since she had gone missing, when authorities revealed that they had identified a possible person of interest from the extensive list of registered sex offenders under review. That person was 30-year-old Sung-Koo Kim, a former genetics student from Tigard, Oregon. Detectives learned that Kim still lived with his parents and led an extremely isolated life. Those who had known him described him as socially withdrawn, awkward, and uncomfortable, especially around women. What particularly drew investigators' attention was that, just 11 days before Brooke disappeared, Kim had been arrested on unrelated charges for breaking into college dormitories and stealing women's underwear. The nature of his offenses, combined with the timing and his proximity to the area, made him an immediate priority for closer investigation. During that earlier arrest, officers had uncovered evidence that deeply unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. Inside Sung-Koo Kim's bedroom, they discovered over 3,400 pairs of women's underwear, approximately 40,000 images depicting sexual violence and torture, and 7 assault rifles. Even more disturbing was a strange and meticulous collection of dryer lint, each sample carefully labeled by location. When investigators traced some of the lint, they found that portions had come from the Oak Park Apartments, the very same complex where Brooke had been abducted. The discoveries did not end there. A search of Kim's computer revealed a hidden document describing, in explicit and horrifying detail, a plan to strangle and mutilate a woman. The file outlined graphic acts of torture and violence, suggesting an individual consumed by dark, predatory fantasies. At the time Brooke disappeared, Kim had been out on bail for his previous crimes. To the task force, this combination of factors, his violent obsessions, escalating behavior, and physical proximity to the abduction site, made him an immediate and alarming suspect. One investigator later explained that Kim's profile matched what experts often saw in serial sexual predators, a socially withdrawn man whose fantasies had begun to spill into real-world violence. While detectives worked frantically to collect enough evidence for a new arrest warrant, this time directly connected to Brooke's disappearance, they knew the legal process would take time. Each hour that passed felt heavier than the last. In the meantime, search teams refused to slow down. Crews and volunteers combed through rivers, lakes, ponds, wooded areas, and even stretches of the Oregon coastline, hoping to find any trace of the missing young woman. Despite their relentless efforts, every lead turned into another dead end. As May 28th arrived, 5 long days since Brooke had vanished, the initial surge of hope within the task force began to fade. Many investigators privately feared that they were running out of time and clues. Then, just as frustration was reaching its peak, a breakthrough finally came. Authorities obtained a formal arrest warrant for Sung-Koo Kim, marking a critical though uncertain turning point in the case. At dawn on May 29th, the stillness of a quiet suburban neighborhood was shattered when a SWAT team surrounded the home of Kim's parents. Officers ordered him to show his hands as they moved in to execute the warrant. Inside the residence, investigators found more incriminating material: computers, cameras, videotapes, and even a book titled The Beginner's Guide to Lockpicking. Kim was arrested and placed in custody, his bail set at $10 million. However, back at the task force command center, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. A serious debate broke out among investigators. Some were convinced that Sung-Koo Kim was the man responsible for Brooke's abduction, while others were not so sure. The evidence, while disturbing and suggestive, failed to directly link him to the crime. And without that crucial connection, the question remained painfully unresolved: had they really caught Brooke's abductor, or were they still looking for someone else? Kim soon offered what appeared to be a solid alibi. He told investigators that on the morning Brooke vanished, he had been at home making stock purchases online at 11:14 a.m. To support his claim, he pointed to a store surveillance video from Tigard, roughly 76 miles from Corvallis, that showed him buying a laptop just over an hour after Brooke disappeared. The footage placed him far from the scene, forcing detectives to reconsider their theory. As they reviewed the evidence, investigators realized there was nothing that physically tied Kim to Brooke's disappearance. There was no DNA, no eyewitness, and no proof that he had even been in Corvallis that morning. The entire case against him, once so promising, began to collapse. Without direct evidence, prosecutors had no legal basis to charge him in connection with Brooke's abduction. The realization hit the task force hard. If Kim wasn't the one responsible, that meant the real abductor was still free and possibly preparing to strike again. The pressure to find answers grew more intense by the hour. By then, it had been 5 days since 19-year-old Brooke Wilberger vanished while cleaning a lamppost near Oregon State University. Each hour that passed without progress deepened the dread among investigators and her family alike. The community that had once felt safe now lived under a shadow of fear, knowing that a dangerous predator was still out there watching, waiting, and capable of doing it again. Authorities had taken 30-year-old Sung-Koo Kim into custody, but despite his deeply disturbing background, investigators still lacked the concrete evidence needed to tie him directly to Brooke Wilberger's disappearance. While federal and local agents continued working to strengthen their case, they also poured every available resource into the ongoing search for the missing college student. 3-person search teams were deployed across 5 Oregon counties, scouring backroads, open fields, and dense forest areas. Witnesses later recalled seeing long lines of volunteers stretched across the landscape, men and women moving in unison through the tall grass, calling Brooke's name, determined not to leave a single patch of ground unchecked. Her disappearance had struck at the heart of the Corvallis community. Brooke was known as a kind, dependable young woman, and her story had inspired strangers to join the search, many of them giving up their weekends and sleep to help bring her home. By June 5th, nearly 2 weeks after she vanished, search teams had covered more than 6,700 square miles and logged over 5,000 man-hours in the field. Despite the sheer scale of their efforts, not a single trace of Brooke was found. Exhaustion began to set in, and the emotional toll on volunteers was evident. Every search that ended empty-handed weighed heavier than the last. Eventually, investigators and volunteers were forced to confront a painful truth. The search couldn't go on forever. Many areas had been searched multiple times, and both manpower and morale were running low. When the decision was made to wind down the official search, it felt like defeat, a heartbreaking moment for everyone who had hoped that somewhere, somehow, Brooke might still be found alive. As the massive search effort came to an end, debate within the task force intensified. Some investigators continued to believe that Sung-Koo Kim was responsible for Brooke Wilberger's disappearance, while others began to question that theory. One detective later admitted that Kim had initially seemed like the most convincing suspect. The timing, his disturbing criminal history, and his proximity to the area all appeared to fit. Yet, after months of exhaustive investigation, no solid evidence linked him to the crime. 5 long months passed as the task force worked tirelessly to find a connection between Kim and Brooke's disappearance. Every lead was pursued, every tip rechecked, but the results were always the same, nothing conclusive. Kim continued to deny any involvement, and his alibi held firm. Investigators even revisited earlier reports about a green van seen near the Oregon State University campus. But that promising clue also dissolved into another dead end. What had once been a fast-moving investigation had now gone completely cold. With few options left, Brooke's family focused on keeping the search alive in the public eye. They announced a $30,000 reward for information leading to her discovery, hoping that money might motivate someone to come forward. Tips continued to arrive, but none provided the breakthrough everyone desperately needed. Despite the growing despair, Brooke's mother refused to give up hope. She later said that until there was undeniable proof to the contrary, she would hold on to the belief that her daughter was still alive. "Until you can show me her body," she told reporters, "I'll always feel that she's out there somewhere." Then, on the 29th of November, 2004, more than 6 months after Brooke Wilberger's disappearance, an eerily similar crime took place 1,400 miles away in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Late that night, a blonde Russian exchange student was walking along a dimly lit street near the University of New Mexico when she was suddenly grabbed at knife point and forced into the back of a red car. Her attacker threatened to kill her if she didn't obey. He ordered her to undress, then drove her to a deserted parking lot where he bound her ankles with a shoelace, tied her wrists with a scarf, and stuffed her underwear into her mouth, securing it with another shoelace around her head. Terrified and restrained, the young woman feared she would not make it out alive. The man later drove to a second location, parking outside an apartment complex. When he stepped out of the vehicle for a moment, the student managed to loosen her bindings. Realizing it was her only chance to escape, she tore free, bolted from the car, and ran barefoot and unclothed through traffic, screaming for help. A woman waiting at a red light witnessed the horrifying scene, a terrified young woman sprinting across the intersection, pleading desperately for help. The victim reached a nearby restaurant and banged frantically on the locked door, trying to alert the employees inside. Shocked by her appearance, the workers hesitated to act, leaving her outside, trembling and exposed, as her attacker fled into the night. The bystander who had seen her running quickly followed and pulled into the parking lot to check on her. Realizing the student was in danger, she ushered her into her car and offered her something to cover herself. Still shaking and bleeding, the young woman tried to explain what had happened. Through tears and broken English, she managed to say that she had been walking when a man attacked her and forced her into his car at knife point. As the Good Samaritan dialed 911, the victim's fear only deepened. While she was still speaking to the dispatcher, the same red car that had abducted her slowly circled past the parking lot. The witness immediately noticed something eerie, a stuffed animal in the rear window, exactly as the victim had described. Moments later, before police could arrive, the vehicle disappeared into the darkness. Within minutes, officers reached the scene. Officer Ed Taylor found the terrified young woman trembling and bleeding. She struggled to recount the ordeal, but managed to describe the car, clearly a red vehicle with a stuffed animal in the back window. Determined to locate the suspect, Taylor began searching the surrounding neighborhoods. When he turned onto a quiet cul-de-sac, something caught his attention. A red car sat parked along the curb, matching the exact description the victim had given. The stuffed animal was visible in the rear window, confirming his suspicion. Taylor parked his patrol car nearby and stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. 10 to 15 minutes later, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the darkness. A man was walking toward the red car. When the stranger saw the officer, he paused briefly, then nodded in acknowledgement. Taylor's instincts told him he might be looking at the man responsible for the attack, and he closed the distance carefully, ready for whatever would happen next. The officer asked the man for his name, and he calmly replied, "Joel Courtney." Acting on instinct, the officer placed him under arrest and conducted a full-body search. He found a small knife hidden on Courtney's person, along with a glass crack pipe. Strangely, Courtney didn't ask why he was being detained. He stayed silent the entire time, even as he was taken to the substation for questioning. At Albuquerque Police Headquarters, the Russian exchange student was brought in to view a lineup. Without hesitation, she pointed to Courtney, positively identifying him as her attacker. The 8-year-old married father of 3 was promptly charged with first-degree rape, kidnapping, and aggravated battery. As detectives dug into his background, they uncovered a disturbing history of violence. Courtney had a record of domestic abuse, including an incident so severe that one of his children had once called 911 inches fear. He had a pattern of unstable behavior, frequent moves across states, and a long history of drug use. There were even reports, some never officially filed, linking him to other sexual assaults. Then, investigators made a discovery that changed everything. They found an outstanding warrant for Courtney's arrest in Newport, Oregon, after he failed to appear for a DUI hearing on the 24th of May, 2004, the very day Brooke Wilberger disappeared. Records revealed that on that morning, Courtney had left Portland, Oregon, heading south to Newport. His route would have taken him directly through Corvallis, passing the Oak Park apartments, where Brooke had last been seen alive. On the 7th of December, 2004, more than 6 months after Brooke Wilberger's disappearance, an Albuquerque detective reached out to Detective Sean Hall in Corvallis with a question that would reopen the stalled investigation. He asked whether the Corvallis Police Department had experienced any similar stranger abductions. It was an unusual inquiry, one that signaled the detective in New Mexico suspected a pattern connecting their recent assault case to something far bigger. For months, the Oregon Task Force had been chasing dead ends. Their only prior suspect, Sung-Koo Kim, had been thoroughly investigated but ultimately cleared of any direct connection. Now, for the first time in half a year, a new name had entered the case: Joel Patrick Courtney. As investigators began piecing together Courtney's movements, the parallels between his attack in Albuquerque and Brooke's disappearance in Corvallis became impossible to ignore. Both victims were young blonde women. Both attacks occurred near college campuses, and both involved violent, opportunistic abductions carried out in broad daylight. Still, detectives knew suspicion wasn't enough. They had no witnesses, no body, and no physical evidence tying Courtney to Brooke. Connecting him to the crime would require extraordinary proof, and after 6 months of heartbreak and uncertainty, the task force could only hope they had finally found the man responsible for taking Brooke Wilberger. Investigators pointed out that their earlier suspect, 30-year-old Sung-Koo Kim, exhibited an alarming obsession with women, particularly through acts of voyeurism and theft. His history of stealing women's underwear and his disturbing collection of violent imagery revealed a clear pattern of sexual deviance. Still, detectives admitted there was no definitive way to determine whether similar crimes committed by others could have been first-time offenses or part of a deeper, unrecorded pattern. At that stage, both Kim and Joel Courtney remained viable suspects in Brooke Wilberger's disappearance. However, investigators began to shift their focus more heavily toward Courtney, whose behavior and movements on the day of Brooke's abduction appeared far more consistent with the crime. Detectives interviewed Courtney's relatives, who lived near Portland, about 85 miles north of Corvallis. His family confirmed that he had stayed with them the night before Brooke went missing, and that he had left their home around 7:30 a.m. the following morning, early enough to reach Corvallis by 9:30 or 10 a.m. They added that his trip that day had been connected to a court appearance for a prior DUI charge. Further investigation revealed that Courtney had been employed by a janitorial company at the time and had been assigned a green work van used for deliveries throughout the Pacific Northwest. Rather than waiting to obtain a search warrant, investigator John Chilcote took a bold step. He purchased the van for $3,200 to ensure it could be examined immediately before any potential evidence was lost. When forensic specialists inspected the vehicle, they discovered that the back seat had been replaced, prompting the critical question of whether any trace or biological evidence had survived. Laboratory analysts warned that because the van had been used by multiple employees and routinely cleaned with industrial chemicals, any DNA or fibers might have been heavily degraded or destroyed, complicating the search for definitive proof. Investigators understood that the odds of uncovering solid evidence were extremely low, yet they felt the search was worth pursuing. The green van remained the only substantial physical lead available, and they were determined to examine it exhaustively. At the FBI's evidence garage, agents began a meticulous forensic inspection. Every detail, no matter how minor, was treated as potentially significant. They dismantled the van piece by piece, removing seats, cutting out carpet sections, vacuuming every surface, and dusting for fingerprints across the entire interior. Every fragment of material collected was carefully cataloged, sealed, and sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for advanced DNA testing. The task force's primary objective was to identify any DNA link between Brooke Wilberger and the materials recovered from the van. To make that possible, they needed a genetic sample from Joel Courtney for comparison. While Courtney remained in custody in Albuquerque, Detective Shan Hall and his team traveled there to collect his fingerprints, saliva swabs, and hair samples from both his head and pubic area. Throughout the entire procedure, Courtney remained eerily composed and silent. He neither objected nor offered an explanation. Detectives later noted that his calm detachment seemed unnerving, as if he were emotionally disconnected from the gravity of the investigation. By February 2005, investigators officially eliminated Sung-Koo Kim from consideration, confirming that no evidence connected him to Brooke's disappearance. Kim later pleaded guilty to charges of burglary and theft involving women's underwear and received a sentence of nearly 6 years in prison. With Kim ruled out, attention narrowed entirely on Joel Courtney. To the task force, every aspect of his behavior, criminal history, and movements on the day of the abduction matched the psychological and logistical profile of Brooke Wilberger's likely kidnapper. Exactly 1 year after Brooke's disappearance, on the 24th of May 2005, Supervisory Special Agent Joe Buer received a call from the FBI's DNA analysis unit in Quantico. On the other end of the line, an analyst told him something that would change the course of the investigation. "You're not going to believe what we found in the van." When Buer asked for clarification, the analyst replied, "We found Joel Courtney's DNA." At first, Buer acknowledged that the discovery was an important development, but not yet conclusive. Then came the statement that left him stunned. "We also found Brooke Wilberger's DNA in the same area." For a brief moment, he was silent, realizing that the year-long mystery had finally produced undeniable proof. When Buer relayed the discovery to the task force, a surge of emotion filled the room. After months of frustration, uncertainty, and false leads, they finally had definitive forensic evidence connecting Joel Courtney to Brooke's disappearance. The team knew they could now move forward with formal charges against him. Yet, even as the news brought a sense of victory, it also carried deep sorrow. The confirmation of Brooke's DNA in the van meant only one thing: she was no longer alive. Investigators later recalled how the weight of that realization settled over the entire team. One agent reflected somberly that while they had achieved the breakthrough they had worked toward for so long, it came with the heartbreaking duty of telling Brooke's family that the hope they had held on to for a year was finally gone. The news came shortly after Brooke's family had held a press conference in Corvallis, marking 1 year since her disappearance. When the FBI reached out with the update, her parents experienced conflicting emotions. Brooke's mother recalled feeling an initial sense of relief, saying that at least there was finally something concrete to pursue and that DNA evidence was powerful proof. Yet, as she and her husband drove home, that sense of strength gave way to grief. They both wept, knowing that their daughter's fate was now tragically certain. In July, FBI agents traveled to Albuquerque to formally serve Joel Courtney with a 19-count indictment in connection with Brooke Wilberger's disappearance. The charges included multiple counts of aggravated murder, the most severe criminal charge under Oregon law, carrying the potential for the death penalty. Even so, investigators still lacked one critical piece of the puzzle: Brooke's body. They presented Courtney with an opportunity to cooperate, warning him that any leverage he had would vanish once she was found. Despite the offer, Courtney refused to talk. He remained in custody in New Mexico, awaiting trial for the violent assault and kidnapping of the Russian exchange student. According to detectives, Courtney appeared determined to delay his case in Albuquerque for as long as possible, knowing that once it concluded, he would be extradited to Oregon to face murder charges in Brooke's case. On the 11th of December 2007, he finally pled guilty to the New Mexico kidnapping and rape, receiving an 18-year prison sentence. For Brooke's family, the waiting continued. Years had passed since their daughter disappeared, and despite the evidence, the man accused of taking her life refused to speak. Only Joel Courtney knew what had happened on that day in May 2004, and whether he would ever reveal the truth remained uncertain. At that point, Joel Courtney still refused to say a word. Investigators feared that without his cooperation, they might never find Brooke Wilberger's body. Every day that passed made recovery less likely, and the hope of giving her family closure began to fade. By April 4th, 2008, nearly 4 years after Brooke's disappearance and 3 years after Courtney's indictment for aggravated murder, he was serving time in an Albuquerque prison for the kidnapping of the Russian exchange student. After months of legal negotiations, he was finally extradited to Oregon to face trial for Brooke's murder. Benton County District Attorney John Haroldson presented Courtney with a straightforward offer. If he revealed where Brooke's body was, prosecutors would remove the death penalty from consideration and instead pursue a life sentence without parole. It was a final opportunity for Courtney to exchange information for mercy. However, he showed no interest in cooperating. Haroldson gave him 90 days to reconsider, but when the deadline passed, Courtney still remained silent. For the Wilberger family, the wait was excruciating. They had hoped that Courtney might finally confess, believing there was at least a 50-50 chance he would come forward. Each new development raised and then crushed their hopes again. It was an emotional roller coaster, moments of cautious optimism followed by waves of disappointment when nothing happened. Then, after more than a year of silence, everything changed. On September 21st, 2009, Joel Courtney finally accepted the district attorney's offer. He signed an agreement ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of release. Along with the plea deal, he drew a detailed map pinpointing where he had left Brooke's body. Courtney's attorney later revealed the horrifying truth to investigators. On May 24th, 2004, the day Brooke disappeared, Courtney had spotted her while she was cleaning the lamppost near the Oak Park apartments. He then drove away briefly, stopping to approach 2 other women near Oregon State University. Those same women would later describe their unsettling encounters with a man driving a green van, a crucial detail that confirmed investigators' long-held suspicions about Courtney's movements that morning. The confession and the map would finally lead authorities to Brooke, ending one of Oregon's most haunting missing persons cases and bringing long-awaited answers to a family who had never stopped searching for the truth. Courtney eventually returned to the apartment complex where Brooke had been working, choosing a secluded area of the parking lot to carry out his plan. Pretending to be lost, he approached her for directions. Holding what appeared to be a FedEx package, he told her he was trying to locate an address so he could deliver the box to a friend. Brooke, known for her kind and helpful nature, believed his story and walked over to assist him. As she tried to help, Courtney suddenly pulled a knife and pressed it to her throat, forcing her into his van. He then drove about half a mile away, where he stopped to bind her wrists and ankles with duct tape, warning her to stay quiet. From there, he drove to a remote forest roughly 10 miles west of Corvallis. During the terrifying drive, Brooke pleaded for her life. She spoke about her family and told Courtney that she forgave him, urging him to let her go and seek help instead. Courtney mentioned his struggles with drugs and alcohol, and Brooke continued trying desperately to appeal to his conscience. Despite her efforts, he ignored her pleas. Later that evening or early the next morning, Courtney admitted that he sexually assaulted her. He then dragged her into a heavily wooded area where he attempted to strangle her. According to his own account, he believed she was dead, but when he realized she was still alive, he struck her repeatedly with a large tree branch, fatally crushing her skull. After killing her, Courtney hid her body beneath a fallen tree. He carefully covered the area with ferns, leaves, and other forest debris to conceal the site and prevent hikers or loggers from discovering it. On September 21st, 2009, the same day, Courtney signed his plea agreement. A team of 20 FBI evidence recovery agents, along with state and Corvallis police officers, entered the remote forest to retrieve Brooke's remains. Before beginning the search, the team paused for a moment of silence to honor her memory, keeping a promise they had made to her family. The area was thick with vegetation after 5 years of growth. As investigators began sifting through the brush, they discovered small bone fragments scattered near a fallen log and down a nearby slope, including rib bones and other skeletal remains. Among the evidence recovered was a watch, an Ancline timepiece with a chain-link band. When investigators contacted the Wilbergers to ask if Brooke had owned such a watch, their confirmation would provide one more heartbreaking but crucial piece of proof that the long search for Brooke had finally come to an end. One of the investigators recalled that moment vividly. He remembered leaning against something while trying to give a fellow officer the description, but when the officer asked him to text it instead, he complied. A few moments later, the reply came through, confirming that the remains belonged to Brooke. He described feeling a deep heaviness in his heart, a weight that still lingered years later whenever he thought back to that instant. When he asked where exactly they had found her, and was told the area off the nearby highway, he immediately knew the location. He had been out there many times before and realized with painful clarity that he had unknowingly walked near her resting place several times. That realization, he said, was especially difficult to bear. For investigators, there was relief in finally closing the case and in knowing that Joel Courtney, a dangerous serial sexual predator, was no longer free. One of them reflected that he did not believe Brooke Wilberger had been Courtney's first victim, nor that the student in New Mexico would have been his last. It seemed impossible, he said, that Courtney had simply begun committing such crimes at the age of 38. Despite the closure of the investigation, the case would never truly fade from the memories of those who had worked on it. For several officers, it remained one of the most haunting experiences of their careers. And for the Wilberger family, it was something that could never fully disappear from their hearts. Even so, the Wilbergers found the strength to endure their loss through their deep Mormon faith. They expressed the hope that people would remember Brooke for the kind and compassionate person she had been. They also hoped that others might look at their experience and understand that it is possible to survive devastating hardship, to learn forgiveness, and to move forward without being consumed by hate. When people told them that at least they now had closure, Brooke's mother admitted that the word felt wrong. To her, closure didn't truly exist because nothing could undo what had happened. Real justice, she said, would have been for it never to have happened at all. When asked if she thought Courtney should pay for his crime, she quietly agreed. She said she believed that, eventually, he would face judgment, not in this life, but in the one to come, and that would be enough for her.